The mind has a strange habit. It takes what is simple and makes it complicated. It takes what is small and makes it feel enormous. And often, it takes what is not even real and turns it into something we suffer from as if it were happening right now. This is where most of our struggles begin, not in the world outside, but in the world we create inside. Think about how many times a situation itself was harmless, but your thoughts made it unbearable. A simple conversation turns into hours of replaying every word. A small mistake becomes a story about failure. A delay becomes a fear of disaster. In each case, reality offered something limited, but the mind expanded it far beyond its true size. The problem is not thinking itself. Thinking is natural and necessary. The problem begins when thinking loses its purpose and starts feeding on itself. Instead of helping us understand, it traps us in loops. Instead of guiding us forward, it keeps us stuck in place. The mind begins to act not as a tool, but as a creator of unnecessary burdens. If you observe carefully, most of what you overthink never actually happens. The arguments you imagine, the failures you predict, the judgments you fear, these are constructions, not realities. Yet the body reacts as if they are real. The heart races, the chest tightens, sleep disappears. All this not because something has happened, but because something has been imagined. This reveals something important. The mind does not always distinguish between what is real and what is repeatedly thought. The more you dwell on an idea, the more solid it feels. The more you revisit a fear, the more convincing it becomes. Over time, imagined problems begin to feel just as heavy as real ones. But reality itself is often much simpler than the stories we tell about it. A moment happens and then it passes. A mistake is made and then it is done. A person says something and then silence returns. Life moves in a straight line, but the mind pulls us into circles. Consider how much energy is spent not on living, but on anticipating, analyzing, and reanalyzing. Hours are lost trying to control outcomes that are not yet here. Days are weighed down by thoughts about things that may never occur. And in the process, the present moment, the only place where life actually exists, is neglected. Overthinking gives the illusion of control. It makes us feel as if by thinking more, we are preparing better, avoiding danger, or solving problems. But in truth, beyond a certain point, it does none of these things. It does not sharpen decisions, it blurs them. It does not reduce uncertainty, it amplifies it. It does not protect peace, it erodes it. There is a clear difference between useful thought and excessive thought. Useful thought is direct and purposeful. It looks at a situation, understands what can be done, and moves forward. Excessive thought, on the other hand, repeats, doubts, and expands without end. It circles the same point without arriving anywhere. When you begin to notice this difference, something changes. You start to see that not every thought deserves attention. Not every possibility needs to be explored. Not every fear needs to be believed. Thoughts come and go, but they are not commands. They are not facts. They are simply mental events. The difficulty is that the mind prefers complexity. It is drawn to what-if questions, to endless scenarios, to possibilities that stretch far beyond what is likely. It creates layers upon layers until the original situation is almost unrecognizable. What started as something simple becomes something heavy and overwhelming. But if you step back and look again, you will often find that the situation itself has not changed. Only your interpretation of it has grown. This is why learning to see things as they are, not as the mind exaggerates them, is so important. When you strip away the added stories, the imagined outcomes, and the repeated doubts, what remains is often manageable, sometimes even insignificant. For example, a mistake is just a mistake. It does not define your entire future. A delay is just a delay. It does not mean everything will fall apart. A moment of uncertainty is just that, a moment. It does not need to become a permanent state of worry. When you reduce things back to their actual size, they lose much of their power over you. The weight you feel is not always coming from reality itself, but from the layers added on top of it. And this realization is freeing, because if the mind can create unnecessary problems, it also means those problems are not fixed. They are not permanent. They can be seen through, reduced, and let go. This does not mean you stop thinking. It means you begin to think clearly. You begin to recognize when thought is helping and when it is harming. You begin to notice when the mind is solving a problem and when it is simply creating one. With time, you start to trust simplicity again. You respond to what is actua. Ellie in front of you, instead of what might happen or what could have been. You act when action is needed, and you let go when nothing can be done. And slowly, the noise begins to fade. You realize that life itself is not as complicated as it once seemed. It is the constant interference of unnecessary thought that made it feel that way. When that interference quiets down, things become clearer, lighter, and more manageable. Because in the end, most of what troubles us is not the world itself, but the way we think about it. And when that changes, everything begins to feel different. The mind may continue to create, to question, to imagine, but you no longer have to follow it everywhere it goes. You can return to what is real, what is present, and what is actually happening. And in doing so, you begin to see that many of the problems you carried were never truly there to begin with. Only the weight of thinking made them feel real. Worry has a way of convincing us that it is useful. It disguises itself as responsibility, as preparation, as intelligence. It tells us that if we think enough about what might go wrong, we will somehow prevent it. But if you look closely at life itself, you begin to see a simple truth. Worry rarely changes anything outside of us. It only changes the condition within us. A situation in the future is not altered by how much fear we attach to it today. An outcome that is uncertain does not become certain because we rehearse it in our minds over and over again. And yet, despite knowing this, the mind continues to return to worry as if it is doing something meaningful. The illusion of control is what makes worry so persistent. When life feels uncertain, the mind tries to compensate by creating endless predictions. It builds scenarios, calculates outcomes, imagines conversations, and prepares responses to events that have not yet occurred. In doing so, it creates the feeling that something is being done. But in reality, nothing has changed except the present moment being drained of its peace. Worry always lives in the future. It does not exist in what is happening right now. In the present moment, there is usually only a situation, simple, incomplete, and often manageable. But the mind refuses to stay there. It jumps ahead, fills in missing details, and turns possibility into probability and probability into fear. What makes this even more interesting is that most of the things we worry about never take the shape we imagine. Sometimes they do not happen at all. Other times, they happen in a completely different way, or they turn out to be far less severe than expected. The mind, however, does not record these outcomes with equal weight. It remembers the fear more strongly than the relief that follows. This is why worry feels productive even when it is not. It gives the impression of effort. It feels like we are doing something important by thinking through every possible outcome. But in truth, most of this effort is directed toward imaginary situations that may never exist. If worry actually changed outcomes, then those who worry the most would live the most secure and peaceful lives. But observation shows the opposite. Excessive worry does not prevent difficulty. It simply makes the experience of life heavier before difficulty even arrives. There is also a strange pattern in how worry behaves. It rarely stays confined to one situation. A small concern about one area of life often spreads into others. A single uncertainty about work becomes anxiety about the future. A minor misunderstanding becomes fear of loss in relationships. One unanswered question opens the door to many others. Worry multiplies itself without needing permission. And yet, when the moment of truth finally arrives, when the feared situation becomes real, people often discover something surprising. The actual experience requires far less mental preparation than the imagined version. In reality, people respond, adapt, and continue. The mind, however, had already lived through dozens of imagined failures before anything even happened. This shows a clear imbalance between anticipation and reality. The mind spends more energy constructing possible suffering than it does handling actual events. And in doing so, it creates a double burden. First, the imagined weight, and then sometimes the real one. It is important to understand that this is not about ignoring responsibility or refusing to plan. Thoughtful preparation has value, but there is a difference between preparation and mental repetition. Preparation leads to clarity and action. Worry leads to repetition and exhaustion. One moves forward, the other circles in place. When you begin to observe worry closely, you will notice that it rarely arrives with solutions. It arrives with questions that have no immediate answers. It asks, "What if?" without offering, "What now?" And without grounding in action, these questions become loops that feed on themselves. The body also responds to worry as if something real is happening. Even when you are sitting still, the mind can create tension, restlessness, and fatigue. This is because the body does not fully distinguish between real external danger and imagined internal scenarios. To it, repeated thought can feel like repeated experience. This is why prolonged worry is so draining. It consumes energy without producing results. It takes from the present moment without building anything for the future. It is activity without outcome, motion without progress. There is a quiet irony in this. While worry tries to protect us from suffering, it often becomes a source of suffering itself. It does not wait for problems to arrive. It brings them early, in advance, in mental form. It allows us to experience pain that may never need to be experienced. But when you observe life more carefully, you begin to see that most moments are not emergencies. Most situations are not disasters in disguise. They are simply situations, some requiring action, some requiring patience, and many requiring nothing more than time. The mind, however, tends to treat uncertainty as danger. Anything not fully known becomes something to fear. But uncertainty is not the enemy of life. It is part of its structure. Everything that unfolds naturally begins in uncertainty. Growth, change, and opportunity all exist within it. When you try to eliminate uncertainty through worry, you are essentially trying to control the very condition in which life operates. And this attempt is endless, because uncertainty itself never disappears. What does change, however, is your relationship with it. When you stop feeding uncertainty with fear, it becomes less threatening. When you stop adding imagined outcomes to it, it becomes simpler. And when you stop resisting it, you begin to move through it more easily. There is also something deeply important to notice. Worry is always about something that is not present. It pulls attention away from what is real and places it into what is not. In doing so, it quietly removes you from your own life. You are no longer fully here. You are mentally elsewhere, in a place that does not exist. This is why even a peaceful moment can feel heavy when the mind is filled with worry. Nothing outside has changed, but everything inside feels disturbed. If you observe this pattern long enough, you begin to see that worry is not a requirement of care. You can care about your life without constantly fearing it. You can plan without panicking. You can prepare without suffering in advance. And slowly, a shift begins to happen. Instead of reacting to every imagined outcome, you begin to respond to what is actually in front of you. Instead of chasing control over everything, you focus on what can truly be influenced. Instead of living in anticipation, you return to action when action is needed, and rest when it is not. In this way, life becomes less crowded with imagined problems. The mind becomes less occupied with futures that may never arrive. And the present moment begins to feel more stable, more usable, and more real. Because ultimately, worry does not change what is coming. It only changes how we experience what is now. And when that is understood, something quiet becomes clear. Most of what we fear is not life itself, but the stories the mind builds about it. Action has a strange kind of honesty that thinking alone never has. Thought can imagine success without effort, failure without experience, and solutions without testing them in reality. But action removes illusion. It reveals what is real, what works, and what does not. And because of this, clarity does not come from thinking more, it comes from doing. Many people believe that if they think long enough, they will eventually arrive at certainty. They assume that confusion is solved by more analysis, more reasoning, more internal debate. But in practice, endless thinking often does the opposite. It multiplies possibilities instead of narrowing them. It creates branches of what could be without ever confirming what is. This is how the mind can remain busy while the situation remains unchanged. A person can think about a decision for days, weeks, or even longer and still feel no closer to resolution. Not because the answer is missing, but because thinking alone is not designed to complete uncertainty. It is designed to explore it. Action, however, behaves differently. The moment you act, even in a small way, something becomes real, a choice is made, a direction is taken, and from that point, feedback appears. You see results. You observe consequences. You learn from experience instead of imagination. This is why clarity often arrives after action, not before it. Before action, everything is theoretical. After action, reality begins to speak. Consider how confusion works in everyday life. A person may feel unsure about a path forward, whether in work, relationships, or personal goals. In the mind, every option seems equally uncertain. Every outcome feels unpredictable. The longer the thinking continues, the heavier the confusion becomes. It starts to feel like there is no correct direction at all. But once action begins, even imperfect action, something shifts. The fog does not disappear instantly, but it begins to thin. One step reveals what the next step might be. One experience corrects false assumptions. One mistake teaches more than hours of speculation ever could. This is because reality is always more precise than imagination. Imagination is broad, unlimited, and often exaggerated. It can expand possibilities endlessly without cost. But reality is selective. It responds with facts, not theories. It confirms some ideas and rejects others. And in doing so, it simplifies what the mind made complicated. There is also a hidden trap in overthinking. It creates the illusion that more thought will lead to perfect certainty before any movement is required. The mind wants to eliminate all risk before taking a step. It wants guarantees before participation. But life rarely offers such conditions. Most meaningful experiences require stepping forward without full clarity. If you wait for complete certainty, action is delayed indefinitely. And during that delay, nothing new is learned. The situation remains abstract, untouched by reality. The mind continues to rotate the same thoughts, but no new information enters the system. Action interrupts this loop. It introduces reality into the equation. And reality, unlike thought, does not repeat itself endlessly. It evolves with experience. There is also a psychological shift that happens through action. When you act, even in uncertainty, you begin to develop trust in your ability to respond. You realize that not knowing everything in advance does not prevent you from handling what comes. This reduces the pressure to have all answers beforehand. Without action, the mind overestimates difficulty because everything remains unknown. Unknown things tend to feel larger, more threatening, and more complex than they are. But once you engage with them directly, they often shrink to manageable proportions. This is why many fears exist only before experience. The anticipation of an event is often heavier than the event itself. The imagination builds resistance, but reality usually requires less emotional effort than expected. Action also breaks the cycle of repetition. When you are only thinking, you revisit the same ideas repeatedly. There is no new input to change the pattern. But when you act, even in a small way, new information enters the mind. This disrupts repetition and creates movement in thinking itself. Over time, this creates a healthier relationship between thought and reality. Thought becomes a tool for preparation and reflection, not a substitute for living. It begins to support action rather than replace it. Another important aspect is that action reveals priorities. In theory, everything can seem equally important. But when you begin doing things, you quickly discover what actually matters and what does not. Some concerns lose weight once you are engaged in real tasks. Some decisions resolve themselves simply through involvement. This natural filtering process cannot happen through thinking alone. The mind treats all possibilities as active. Reality does not. It forces selection. There is also a deeper reason why action leads to clarity. Life itself is experienced through interaction, not observation alone. You cannot fully understand a situation by standing outside it mentally. Understanding grows when you are involved in it. Just as a person cannot learn swimming by analyzing water, many aspects of life require participation to be understood. This does not mean thinking has no role. Thought is necessary for direction. It helps frame decisions, assess options, and reflect on outcomes. But it becomes unproductive when it replaces engagement with reality. When thinking becomes a substitute for experience, it stops being helpful and starts becoming a barrier. The challenge is that the mind often prefers thinking because it feels safe. Action carries uncertainty, exposure, and possible mistakes. Thinking, on the other hand, feels controlled. It allows endless rehearsal without consequence. But this safety is deceptive because it also prevents resolution. Real clarity often requires stepping into discomfort, not because discomfort is valuable in itself, but because it is the entry point to real feedback. Without feedback, there is no correction. Without correction, there is no refinement. Over time, those who rely only on thinking tend to accumulate more confusion. Those who combine thought with action tend to accumulate understanding. The difference is not intelligence. It is engagement with reality. Even small actions matter. Clarity does not require dramatic steps. It begins with movement, however small, that connects thought to the real world. Once that connection is made, thinking becomes grounded. It stops drifting into endless possibilities and begins aligning with actual experience. And as this pattern continues, something subtle changes. Decisions become easier. Uncertainty becomes less overwhelming. Not because life becomes simpler, but because you begin to trust the process of learning through doing. Eventually, you realize that clarity was never something to be found entirely in the mind. It was something revealed through interaction with life itself. The more you engage, the more you understand. The more you wait, the more confusion grows. And so, instead of searching endlessly for perfect understanding before beginning, you begin to see the value of beginning itself. Because clarity is not the starting point of action, it is often its result. And when this becomes clear, another truth naturally follows. The mind alone cannot resolve everything it creates. Sometimes it must step aside and let reality respond. The present moment is the only place where anything real has ever happened, and yet it is also the place the mind most often ignores. It is overlooked not because it is unimportant, but because it is too simple for a restless mind to value. The mind prefers movement across time, backward into memory, forward into imagination, because those spaces feel rich with meaning. But in doing so, it quietly abandons the only point where life actually exists. When you observe your experience closely, you will notice that nothing can be lived in the past. The past is only thought. It is a reconstruction made of memory, interpretation, and emotion. It is not happening now. Similarly, the future is not life, it is projection. It is an arrangement of possible events shaped by expectation and fear. It has not arrived, and in many cases, it may never arrive in the form imagined. Yet the mind spends most of its time in these two places, treating them as if they are real environments. It revisits the past to relive what is already finished, and it moves into the future to rehearse what has not yet occurred. In both directions, attention is pulled away from the present, where life is actually unfolding. This creates a quiet distortion in experience. A person can be physically sitting in a calm environment, but mentally they are elsewhere, replaying a conversation from yesterday or preparing for something that may happen tomorrow. The body remains in the present, but awareness is divided. And when awareness is divided, even simple moments begin to feel heavy. The present moment by itself is rarely overwhelming. Most of the time, what is actually happening right now is manageable. There may be a task, a conversation, a sensation, or even silence. But when the mind adds layers from the past or future, the simplicity of the moment is replaced with complexity that does not truly belong to it. This is why stress often feels disproportionate to the situation at hand. The situation itself may be small, but the mental additions surrounding it make it large. A single event becomes surrounded by memory of similar failures or imagination of possible consequences. The present is no longer seen clearly. It is filtered through time. If you strip away these additions, what remains is usually far simpler than expected. A conversation is just a conversation. A task is just a task. A moment is just a moment. The weight comes not from the present itself, but from everything the mind attaches to it. There is also a strange irony in how the mind treats time. When people are in the present, they often wish they were somewhere else, waiting for something better or regretting something already gone. But when they look back later, they realize that many of the moments they overlooked were actually neutral or even peaceful. They were just not recognized at the time because attention was elsewhere. This suggests that experience is not only shaped by what happens, but also by where attention is placed. The same moment can feel completely different depending on whether the mind is present or absent. When attention is grounded in the now, even ordinary experiences become clearer. When attention is scattered across time, even simple experiences feel distorted. The present moment does not demand perfection. It does not require everything to be resolved or understood. It only requires awareness. But the mind resists this simplicity because it is accustomed to movement. Stillness feels unfamiliar, and so it creates movement internally through thought. However, this movement is not the same as living. Thinking about life is not the same as experiencing it. Recalling a moment is not the same as being in it. Anticipating an event is not the same as engaging with it when it arrives. The present is where all action actually occurs. Every decision, every interaction, every change happens here. Even when planning for the future, the act of planning is happening now. Even when remembering the past, the act of remembering is happening now. There is no escape from the present, only a shift in attention away from it. This means that most of life is not lost because it is absent, but because it is unnoticed. It is happening continuously, but awareness is not always fully there to experience it. When attention returns to the present, something subtle changes. The pressure of time begins to ease. The mind is no longer pulled in multiple directions at once. There is less accumulation of imagined burdens. Instead, there is a clearer sense of what is actually happening. This clarity does not require effort in the usual sense. It is not achieved by forcing the mind to stop thinking. Rather, it emerges when unnecessary mental movement settles. When attention is no longer constantly traveling, perception becomes more direct. In this directness, even ordinary moments feel more complete. A simple task does not feel like a step toward something distant. It becomes complete in itself. A conversation is not just a preparation for future reflection. It is experienced as it unfolds. Life becomes less about constant arrival somewhere else and more about being here. It is also important to recognize that the present moment is not static. It is always changing, always moving. But it changes within itself, not away from itself. One moment becomes the next without requiring mental escape into another time. Flow exists naturally in the present when it is fully observed. The difficulty arises when the mind tries to hold on to what is already gone or reach toward what is not yet here. This creates tension against the natural movement of time. But when attention aligns with what is actually happening, there is less resistance. This does not mean ignoring the past or future entirely. Memory and planning have their place, but they function best when they are tools used in the present, not places where attention permanently resides. Reflection is useful when it informs understanding now. Planning is useful when it guides action now. But when they become constant mental locations, they pull life away from direct experience. There is also a quiet freedom in realizing that the present is always available. It is not something that must be created or achieved. It is already here. What changes is only awareness of it. And when this awareness strengthens, something important becomes clear. Many of the burdens carried through time are not part of life itself, but part of the mind's movement away from it. The weight of regret belongs to the past. The weight of fear belongs to the future, but neither exists in the present moment in the way the mind presents them. What remains when attention returns is usually simpler than expected. A situation, a breath, a step, a decision, just what is here. And as this becomes clearer, another understanding begins to form. Life is not missed because it is absent, but because attention is elsewhere. And when attention returns, the need to escape into past or future begins to dissolve, revealing that the present moment was always enough as it is. Simplicity is often misunderstood as something lesser, as if a simple life is a reduced version of a meaningful one. But in reality, simplicity is not the absence of depth. It is the removal of unnecessary noise that hides depth. When life becomes overly complicated, it is not more meaningful. It is just harder to see clearly. And what cannot be seen clearly cannot be lived peacefully. The mind has a tendency to complicate things that are naturally straightforward. It adds layers of comparison, expectation, fear, and judgment to experiences that, in their raw form, are simple. A decision becomes a battlefield of what-ifs. A relationship becomes a network of imagined outcomes. A goal becomes entangled with pressure, identity, and future fears. In each case, the core reality is small, but the mental construction around it becomes large. Simplicity is not about having fewer experiences. It is about reducing the unnecessary weight attached to them. Life itself is already complex enough in its natural unfolding. It does not need constant mental expansion to become meaningful. In fact, the more the mind interferes, the more distorted experience becomes. If you observe closely, peace rarely comes from adding more. It comes from removing what is unnecessary. A room becomes peaceful not when more objects are placed inside it, but when clutter is removed. In the same way, the mind becomes peaceful not when more thoughts are added, but when excessive ones settle. The natural state of the mind is not chaos, it is clarity. But clarity is easily covered by overthinking, constant analysis, and emotional exaggeration. These layers create the illusion that life is complicated, when in fact it is often the mind that is complicated. Many of the difficulties people experience are not caused by the situation itself, but by the mental resistance built around it. A situation arises, and instead of being met directly, it is surrounded by interpretations. These interpretations multiply until the original situation is almost unrecognizable. For example, a simple mistake can become a reflection of identity. A single failure can become a story about the future. A small disagreement can become a projection of long-term loss. None of these expansions exist in the moment itself. They are built afterward, through thought. Simplicity breaks this pattern. It returns attention to what is actually present, not what is imagined around it. It asks a simple question: what is truly happening here, without the extra layers added by the mind? When this question is applied honestly, many complications begin to dissolve. What seemed overwhelming often becomes manageable. What felt heavy often becomes lighter, not because reality has changed, but because unnecessary interpretation has been removed. There is also a natural economy to simplicity. The mind consumes energy when it constantly processes unnecessary thoughts. Every additional layer of worry, comparison, or prediction requires mental effort. Over time, this creates fatigue, even when nothing physically demanding is happening. Simplicity reduces this burden. It allows the mind to focus only on what is relevant, present, and actionable. Instead of scattering attention across multiple imagined scenarios, it brings it back to what is real and immediate. This reduces internal friction and conserves mental energy. Another important aspect of simplicity is clarity in decision-making. When the mind is cluttered, even small choices feel complicated. Too many thoughts compete for attention, making it difficult to see a clear direction. But when unnecessary thoughts are reduced, decisions become more direct. The essential stands out more easily. This does not mean that life becomes free of difficulty. Challenges still exist. Uncertainty still exists. But simplicity changes how they are experienced. Instead of being multiplied by mental noise, they are seen more directly, without distortion. There is also a subtle emotional effect. A complicated mind tends to amplify emotions. Small concerns feel larger. Minor setbacks feel heavier. The emotional response becomes shaped not only by the event, but by the mental buildup around it. Simplicity reduces this amplification. It allows emotions to arise without unnecessary exaggeration. This is why simple people often appear more composed. It is not that they experience less, but that they add less to what they experience. Their internal world is not constantly expanding every moment into something larger than it is. Simplicity also restores a sense of proportion. It helps distinguish between what is important and what is not. The mind, when left unchecked, tends to treat everything as equally significant. Every thought feels urgent. Every possibility feels important. But in reality, only a small portion of what we think about requires attention. By reducing mental clutter, importance becomes clearer. What truly matters stands out naturally, without forcing or overanalysis. This allows energy to be directed where it is actually needed, rather than being spread across everything equally. There is also a deeper freedom in simplicity. When life is not constantly interpreted, judged, or overanalyzed, there is more space to simply experience it. Moments are not immediately turned into problems or projects. They are allowed to exist as they are. This does not require withdrawing from life. It simply requires reducing unnecessary interference with it. You can still act, plan, engage, and respond, but without turning every moment into something heavier than it is. Over time, this way of living creates a quiet stability, not because life becomes predictable, but because the mind becomes less reactive. It no longer builds excessive meaning around every event. It responds more directly to what is present. It is also important to understand that simplicity is not something forced. It is something uncovered. Beneath all the mental additions, there is already a simpler way of seeing. It does not need to be created. It needs to be revealed by removing what hides it. The difficulty is that the mind is accustomed to complexity. It often mistakes mental activity for importance. But not every thought adds value. Not every interpretation improves understanding. And not every layer of analysis brings clarity. When this is seen clearly, a shift begins to happen. The mind starts to question its own unnecessary movements. It begins to recognize when it is adding complexity where none is needed, and gradually it begins to step back. As this stepping back continues, life does not lose meaning. Instead, meaning becomes clearer because it is no longer buried under excess thought. What remains is more direct, more grounded, and more real. And slowly, a quiet realization emerges. Peace was never hidden by life itself, but by the unnecessary complexity added to it. When that complexity reduces, what remains is not emptiness, but clarity, simple, steady, and enough as it is. Control is one of the mind's strongest desires, and also one of its most persistent illusions. It feels natural to want control over outcomes, people, timing, and circumstances. The mind believes that if enough effort is applied, life can be shaped into something predictable. But experience repeatedly shows a different truth. Much of life does not respond to control, but to interpretation. There is a clear difference between what can be influenced and what cannot. Yet the mind often treats everything as if it belongs in the same category. When something goes wrong, it searches for control after the fact. When something is uncertain, it tries to control it in advance. When something is beyond reach, it still attempts mental control through constant thinking, imagining, and worrying. But control over external events is limited. Circumstances shift in ways that cannot always be predicted. People act according to their own thoughts, not ours. Time moves forward regardless of preparation. Even our own bodies and emotions do not always follow strict commands. And yet, despite this, the mind continues to behave as if complete control is possible if only enough effort is applied. This creates unnecessary tension, because when reality does not obey mental expectation, frustration arises. The gap between how things are and how they should be becomes a source of suffering. But this gap is not always caused by reality. It is often created by expectation itself. Control over interpretation, however, is always available. While external events may not be fully shaped by intention, the way they are understood, processed, and responded to remains within influence. This distinction is subtle but important. One belongs to the outside world, the other belongs to internal perspective. Two people can experience the same situation and interpret it completely differently. One sees failure, the other sees learning. One sees delay, the other sees timing. One sees rejection, the other sees redirection. The event is the same, but the meaning assigned to it changes everything. This shows that suffering is not always caused by events themselves, but by the interpretation of events. And interpretation is something the mind actively creates. It is not fixed, it is not forced, it is shaped internally. When this is understood, control begins to shift away from the external world and toward perception. Instead of asking, "How do I control everything that happens?" the more grounded question becomes, "How do I understand what is happening in a way that does not create unnecessary suffering?" This shift is powerful because it removes the impossible burden of controlling life itself. Life is too large, too dynamic, and too interconnected to be fully controlled by individual intention. But the way it is experienced can be refined. Much of what people struggle with comes from resisting this limitation. The mind wants certainty in uncertain systems. It wants fixed outcomes in fluid environments. It wants guarantees in conditions that are constantly changing. And when these demands are not met, anxiety appears. But uncertainty is not an error in life. It is its structure. Everything that involves growth, change, or interaction contains uncertainty. Even simple actions carry unknown elements. The mind, however, often treats uncertainty as a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be understood. When control is expected over everything, even natural variability feels like failure. A delay feels like disruption. A disagreement feels like loss. A change of plan feels like instability. But in reality, these are normal expressions of a system that is not designed for rigid predictability. The moment control is released from what cannot be controlled, mental pressure begins to reduce. Not because life becomes easier, but because resistance to its nature decreases. Instead of constantly pushing against uncertainty, attention shifts toward response. Response is where real control actually exists. Not control over outcomes, but control over participation. You cannot always decide what happens, but you can decide how to engage with what happens. You can choose action, tone, direction, and perspective. This form of control is quieter, but more reliable. It does not depend on external compliance. It depends on internal clarity. And because of this, it remains available even in situations where external control is absent. There is also a psychological relief in accepting limits. The effort to control everything creates constant mental strain because it requires continuous monitoring of possibilities. The mind must stay alert to every outcome, every risk, every variation. This creates exhaustion without resolution. But when limits are acknowledged, the mind no longer has to expand its attention endlessly. It can focus on what is actually within reach. Energy is no longer scattered across imagined control points, but directed toward real, immediate influence. This does not mean passivity. It means precision. Instead of trying to control everything, attention is placed where action is meaningful. Instead of reacting to every possible outcome, energy is reserved for what is present and actionable. Another important realization is that interpretation itself can either increase or reduce suffering. When interpretation is rigid, every event is assigned a fixed meaning, good or bad, success or failure, gain or loss. But life rarely fits into such fixed categories. Most experiences are mixed, transitional, and evolving. When interpretation becomes more flexible, events lose some of their emotional weight. A setback is no longer final. A success is no longer permanent. A change is no longer catastrophic. Meaning becomes less absolute and more fluid. This flexibility reduces internal conflict. Instead of fighting reality to match expectation, the mind adjusts its understanding to match reality. And in this adjustment, tension decreases. There is also a deeper shift that happens when control is seen more clearly. The need to constantly predict outcomes weakens. The need to mentally rehearse every possibility reduces. Attention becomes less scattered across future scenarios and more grounded in present response. This does not remove planning or foresight. It simply removes the compulsive need to mentally dominate everything before it occurs. Planning becomes a tool, not a burden. Awareness becomes active, not anxious. Over time, this creates a more stable inner environment, not because life becomes predictable, but because unpredictability is no longer treated as threat. The mind becomes less reactive to change because it is no longer trying to prevent all change. And in this state, something important becomes clear. Peace does not come from controlling life, but from understanding what control actually means. It is not the ability to direct every outcome, but the ability to remain steady in interpretation, regardless of outcome. As this understanding deepens, another realization naturally follows. Control is not about shaping everything outside, but about refining how everything inside is seen. And when that becomes clear, the need to dominate life begins to fade, replaced by a quieter awareness of what can truly be guided, and what must simply be understood as it unfolds.